Hey, everybody, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Hemmings Hot Rod BBQ Podcast. I am your host, Mike Musto, together today with Evan Perkins, Hemmings Director of Digital Content. Now, for those that don't know, Evan has an in-depth background on everything that has to do with engines. We're talking EFI, building, updating, just everything you can think of. So, sir, how are you doing today, man?
I'm doing good. Glad to be here. And I'm definitely a huge fan of engine tech. So let's talk engines.
Yeah, let's talk engines. Okay, so one of the things, we all dabble in old cars, right? I mean, Hemmings is, with our marketplace and everything else, that's kind of where you go to find the old car. But some of the questions that we get is, how do you update it? How do you make these cars more reliable if you want to keep it relatively original and say not do an engine swap, but want to have it more reliable, more efficient, get a little bit more power here and there, right? So that's kind of what I want to focus on. And then we can dive into a little bit of the tidbits from, exterior modifications like wheels, tires, brakes, interior, and blah, 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 stuff like that. So.
Sure. So I think with any classic car, you sort of have to ask yourself, what are you trying to get out of it? Is it something that you want to put miles on? Is it something that you really enjoy seat time in? Is it, do you want a driver, or are you looking for that nostalgic experience? And that's sort of where the resto mod and EFI updating and a lot of the engine stuff that we can talk about in this podcast kind of come into play. There are definitely certain people, and kudos to them, who buy an old car for the sake of it being an old car and want to keep it that way. And that's totally cool. Like all respect to that kind of, mentality and build, and that's great. But for the guy that just loves the way he feels and looks when he gets out of his muscle car, but still wants to drive it to work every day, have it start when it's below zero outside, get better gas mileage, all the stuff that modern tech does, that's sort of where all of these parts come into play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So, all right. So let's say you're a first time, and I get this question a lot. You're a first time vintage or classic car buyer. Okay. Argument's sake, let's throw a C10 out there, right? A lot of C10 markets super hot. Everybody's buying them. You've got, a 350, a stock 350 under the hood, right? Carbureted. I want more power out of this thing. I want a little better fuel economy. And just to your point, I want it to start when it's cold outside, because the beauty of a C10 is it's old enough to be, beautifully classic and it has that look and feel, but in the same token, relatively modern enough that you could drive it every day. And you and I both see that here in California all the time, right?
Right.
So where would you start? Where would you start if you say reliability, a little better fuel economy, and a little bit more performance?
Gotcha. I think the thing that gets lost in translation when people are looking for all the things that you just described is they're looking for sort of a magic cure-all, right? They want to throw one part at it that does all of those things.
Right.
It's important to remember that you've got to start with something healthy, right? So that means, look at the spark plugs, look at the wires. Is it missing? When was the last time it had a basic tune-up? Do the basic things that you don't intend to change, like the ignition system or things like that, are they working right? Are they healthy? And when then you kind of checked all the boxes that this thing is actually in healthy condition, then you can start looking at things like carburetor replacement EFI, which essentially replaces the carburetor with a throttle injection unit. And that's a great stepping stone for somebody that's looking for a little bit more fuel economy and the ability to tune in a way that a carburetor won't allow you to. So carburetors are excellent fuel delivery devices, but they're dumb. They don't adapt to changing weather conditions. They don't adapt to altitude changes. For somebody that lives, at elevation and drives to places that are at a different elevation, that's a real consideration. Mm-hmm. So you can do that with EFI, and you can't do that with a carb. We also have to kind of frame what carburetor are we talking about? Because if you have a well-tuned, quadrijet versus a Holley HP with no choke, those are two different engines, right? So replacing the carb is going to yield very different results depending on which carb you're actually talking about.
Right. Yeah, and that's, for those out there that are buying their first car, when we talk about changes in elevation, I'm going to give you an example of exactly what happens, okay? Say you're running at sea level or close to sea level, and then for some reason, you decide to head up into the mountains for some reason where the air is, a little bit thinner. I got news. You're going to find that you're going to start going up these inclines and changing this elevation, and all of a sudden, your power is going to drop off. Just a little in the beginning, then a little more, to the point where you're putting your foot down and you're like, why does it feel like I lost half the juice coming out of my engine, right? And that's something that I learned early on with my cars, because I literally thought there was something wrong and I wasn't educated enough yet to understand why that was happening, right? And I think that's part of the process, as well as to understand why things happen with a carbureted vehicle versus a vehicle that utilizes EFI, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's absolutely some truth to the fact that air density is a real thing, and air is denser at sea level than it is at altitude. So you're going to lose power just by nature of there is not as much oxygen in the mountains as there is at the beach. But
Right.
As that air gets thinner, the fuel requirements change, and a carburetor is not going to look at air density and then make fueling changes. Whereas a manifold absolute pressure or MAP sensor can look at the air density and go, "Oh, okay, there's less air. I need less fuel," and make those changes on the fly.
Right. Okay. So, you brought up an absolutely stellar point, which I think a lot of people overlook. What are you starting with? Are you starting with an engine that is healthy? And I think that is such a massively overlooked thing. And I don't know if there's one cure-all. I think it is like anything else. It's the sum of the parts, right? So if you do a tune-up and you look at your plugs, you look at the wires, you look at the distributor, you look at the, what, depending on your engine setup, the electronic ignition and whatnot. How should somebody first diagnose a vehicle? Let's get into that. Like, if they're having problems and they're not getting the fuel economy, what are some of the things that you would look at first?
I think the first place you start is sort of the oil, right? That's going to give you a lot of indication to the health of an engine. And you can sort of rule out some major gremlins right away. So, I mean, if you're looking at oil and it's full of glitter, okay, maybe we need backpedal here, right? If it's super gray and it's got a high water content to it, all right, maybe there's something serious going on, like a head gasket or, potentially a cracked block, or, a radiator that's got an oil cooler or something that's leaking. There's a lot of things that can tell you. So that's an inexpensive first kind of jab at how healthy is this thing. And this is assuming you just rolled a new car into the garage, right?
Right.
Then you move on to things like spark plugs. They're wear items, right? So people just kind of, well, it runs okay. I'm going to go do the next thing. And so again, a spark plug will tell you if there's a lot of oil accumulation going on. It's a good first look at, are the rings healthy? Is there a lot of blow by? Things of that nature. And then you can sort of, it becomes more of an issue of diagnosing a particular problem than just engine health, right? So if the engine's healthy, basic tune-up's going to get you by. But if you've got an engine that's running really poorly, one of the things that kind of working for Holley and experiencing what a lot of people do is they try to throw EFI at it as this method of it's a cure-all for all of the bad engine running conditions. And it's never a satisfactory solution. And, selfishly, like, as the Holley guy, you formerly the Holley guy,
right.
You just kind of look at those people and you're like, it's not our fault, right? We made a great product. and it comes from this swap culture, right? Where magazines have been preaching to people since the, 50s. Go to the junkyard, grab this engine. It's bigger than your old one. Throw it in. Everything's going to be fine. Right. And it's swap culture is a beautiful thing. But not all, core engines are as healthy as the others. So being able to kind of look at what you have and go from there and fix problems before you start upgrading is definitely an important thing.
Okay, so step number one, figure out if you've got a healthy mill, right? Okay, so you've done that now. You've got your engine. For argument's sake, we're going to use a 350 because there's only 9 billion of them running around.
Right.
You've diagnosed it. Oil looks good. Plugs look good. Engine actually runs quite well with a carburetor, okay? But now you want to improve. You want that extra mileage, and you want that turnkey without pumping the pedal 3 or 4 times. And if it's cold, you don't want to deal with that. And if it's altitude, you don't want to deal with that. What's your next step?
I mean, EFI is the obvious upgrade from a carburetor, right? It gives you more control. You can tune for different situations, such as cold start. And you can have a larger throttle body, more air into the engine without the penalty of, drawing a larger quantity of fuel all the time, right? You go from a 400 CFM factory carb to a 950 Holley. It's going to make more power, but it's also pulling fuel in all the time. You put 1,000 CFM throttle body on, if that's just air, right? You're in control of the fuel. It's not a Venturi effect. So you can actually have more air available when you want it, and then not use more fuel when you're at light load, going down the freeway. So I think EFI is the next step, right? But then that's sort of a choose your own ending to, well, what system do you go with? Do you Do you rip the intake manifold off, go to multi-port fuel injection, which is obviously the better solution, the more efficient solution? Or do you kind of go, well, I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. The car already drives nice. I just want a little bit more. And that's where those carburetor replacement throttle body injection style systems kind of fit.
Right. So when we talk about that, can you explain the difference between a throttle body system and a sequential or
Sure.
EFI system?
What we're really talking about is where the fuel enters the engine. So multi-port fuel injection, MPFI, has an injector at each cylinder, and that is going to give somebody a lot more control over where the fuel goes. If you have a throttle body injection system, you have the injectors up sort of where the boosters in a carburetor would be. And you're still putting the fuel into the engine. You're just, now you have less control over where it goes, right? So there's forces acting in an intake manifold, air is swirling, there's, some air is going into ports, other air is getting pushed out a little bit during reversion, during that overlap phase. So it's this giant tornado that's flinging fuel around. So there's sort of no guarantee that every cylinder gets exactly the same amount. You have more control than a carburetor because you can kind of play with things and you can tune to what you're seeing, on the O2 sensor and reading air fuel mixtures, but you don't have as finite of control as where you have one injector per cylinder. So that's sort of the trade-off between the two.
Okay, so if you have, say your motor's is bone stock, right? It's always been stock. You're running a stock, stock crank, stock piston, stock, and everything. Would you say go with a standard throttle body kit as opposed to if you're running? I guess my question is, at what point do you say, tune port is better than, sequential, right? Or multiport?
So when we're talking about sequential, what we're actually talking about is the ability to fire a fuel injector as the intake valve is opening, right? So this is kind of like the pinnacle of multiport technology. The computer actually knows which cylinder is about to fire. It's squirting that injector right as that valve's opening. That's the goal anyway. And then you're getting as much fuel into the cylinder before that valve closes as possible. One step down from that would be batch fire, which, multi-port, but you're firing all injectors at the same time. Still more control than throttle body injected, but a little bit less control than true sequential. So if you look at like modern muscle cars and late model multi-port fuel injected vehicles, those are sequential. That's where the computer gets bigger, things get more efficient. That's sort of the goal that we as the aftermarket are trying to emulate, introduce into a classic car. So,
right. Okay.
That's what we're doing here is we're kind of looking at like, what does the best OEM stuff have? And then how do we make these, older engine architectures utilize that technology?
Do the new fuel injection systems, the new EFI systems, do they have the capabilities to deal with if somebody is building a very high performance motor, right? Are they able to adapt to that? Like if you're running 11.5, 12-to-1 compression, is that out of the ordinary? If you wanted to put an EFI system, will it adapt to that?
You're talking about if you wanted to like change the bottom end on a new muscle car?
That's correct. That is correct.
Gotcha. No, not really. Most of the PCMs have the ability to either be cracked or tuned to accommodate for that. I think the first thing you're going to run into in that situation is, do I have a large enough fuel injector from the factory? Do I have a large enough fuel pump from the factory? But there's typically ways, whether it's through, the name of the company escapes me, but there's plenty of companies like Diablo Sport is one that's kind of known.
Sure.
The Mopar side of things, and there's a couple other companies that have systems that allow you to access a factory ECU. You can, I guess what I'm trying to say is you can absolutely tune for it, but you can't expect to radically increase the boost or increase the compression ratio on a factory engine and have it just run okay.
Okay.
So those computers are sort of designed to make very small changes at a time.
Gotcha. Okay. So I know, and I've used a couple of different systems here, right? For argument's sake, we'll talk about Holley a little bit. We've used Edelbrock and a whole bunch of stuff as well, right? A kit like and again, going back to, we'll use a 350, just like a sniper kit, which is throttle body injection kit, replaces your carburetor, goes right on top. That is, and all these kits are generally marketed as self-learning.
Sure.
Right. You bolt them on and that's it. And then they just learn and they teach themselves. Is it literally that easy, or is that a little bit of a misconception? Or is there still some tuning involved?
So I think self-learning is a wonderful marketing term, and it really, it's hard to downplay the capabilities of a lot of these products. Holley and some of their products, but they self-learn, and they're their greatest advocate and their worst enemy at the same time, because they only have a few things that that are sources of information and data that they're using to create this tune, right? So on a sniper, it's looking at RPM, it's looking at the reading from the oxygen sensor, which is AFR, it's looking at coolant temperature, and it's looking at a few other parameters that you enter in. Well, when there's only a handful of numbers that it's calculating in to create this fuel map, it's really easy to have a problem. If you have a ignition source that's not feeding a clean tach signal, if you have a leak in the exhaust that's giving a faulty bar reading, if you have a cylinder that's got a lot of blow by, I mean, there's a ton of things that can kind of go wrong, right? So if you allow these systems to truly self-learn indefinitely, you sort of expose yourself to this situation where if something goes wrong, and something will go wrong, because these are all projects, these are not OEM vehicles, they're all our projects, it's going to learn in the wrong direction. You get a tank of bad gas, you have or you burn a spark plug dryer. Well, what happens is you have a misfire situation. Misfire means that cylinder's worth of air and fuel didn't burn that cycle, so it gets pumped into the exhaust. Well, the O2 sensor doesn't read fuel, it only reads oxygen. So even though there's fuel in that exhaust, it's not seeing fuel, it's seeing a whole bunch of extra oxygen. So when it sees oxygen, it thinks lean. So it's going to start adding fuel, and then your fuel table gets screwed up because it's looking at the wrong things. And ultimately the car starts running worse and worse and worse. So self-learning is really, really cool. It has its, places, its strengths. But for most people, I think if you have access to a tuner or access to a chassis dyno, the best thing to do is to sort of get the car in there, have a professional work through it. All those systems are laptop tunable, and it's going to yield a better result. It's just like you building your engine in your garage for the first time versus handing it off to the guy who builds, professional circle track engines. He's probably going to build a better motor than you. So same thing with tuning. Yes, they're self-learning. Yes, there are Band-Aids. Yes, there's a ton of information and resources that these companies offer to teach you. But if you have the resources to go have a professional tuner do it, it's better to do it that way. Save that file, turn off self-learning. And then maybe, down the road, as you make changes, you can sort of get it a little bit better even. But the self-learning stuff is not perfect. And I think every company most companies admit that, but it's got a long way to go.
Right. And if the engine isn't running at its peak or at its best prior to that, this self-learning is really only has information that a kind of a poorly running engine is going to give it. Right. Is that correct?
It ultimately doesn't know how healthy the thing beneath it is.
Right.
It's getting feedback saying, give me this much fuel at this much RPM and this much load. And that's all it knows. I mean, the thing could be smoking like a chimney and it's going, I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing.
Right. Okay. So, all right. So we can convert to EFI, right? And there's a lot of, the different systems out there. Now, a lot of terms that you'll hear being thrown around are like, well, do I have to run a return line? Do I have from the fuel tank back up? Or there are some systems that use kind of a reservoir system that let you, allow you to keep your mechanical fuel pump, and it works off kind of this reservoir under the hood. Can you explain a little bit about the difference, how that system works as opposed to a system where you have to run the return line and do all that other fun stuff?
Sure. So there's return style systems and returnless systems. Return style systems take the fuel from the pump, they run it up past the injector to a regulator, then send the extra pressure back to the tank. One of the nice things about that system is they're very quiet. They keep the fuel cool because nothing's living in a 450-degree engine bay all the time. It's just constantly circulating and kind of it's warming up, but it's not getting vapor lock. It's not just a stagnant fuel sitting next to a header. Those tend to be what most modern cars do. It's also a lot easier on the pump because the pump's not deadheaded at 60 psi of pressure all the time. It's kind of allowing it to cycle and just keep going. Those systems tend to last the longest. Return style or returnless systems are definitely have a place. And one of the nice things about those is you don't have to run two fuel lines if there's space constraints, if it's, a car that doesn't make a ton of horsepower and the pump's not having to work too hard. There's definitely places where that fit in. And as long as you're making sure that the pump is compatible with that and that the EFI system has, a regulator that's compatible with that and all the pieces in that system work together, that's another great option. The kind of combination mechanical electronic pump systems, I'm not a huge fan of those. Typically, my point of view is, why have two fuel pumps that are required to run an engine when you can have one? I sort of get where they fit into the world. If somebody has a carburetor and they want to go to fuel injection and they don't want to change all the fuel lines under the car, they can just route that mechanical into this sort of catch can, and then that's got an electronic pump in it, and that boosts the pressure the rest of the way to feed an EFI system. Carbs typically want 6 to 9 psi fuel pressure. Most EFI systems want anywhere from 43 to shooting really high horsepower racing, getting close to 100. That's very, very high end, very high horsepower systems. But if the guy doesn't want to do that and he sort of wants to just make what he has work, I get where it fits in. I would personally never do it. It's not that hard to run fuel line. I'd rather have a return style pump. Those pumps live inside of a tank. They're immersed in fluid. They run cooler. They're quiet. Again, you just sort of look at what OEM manufacturers are doing and going, well, they have, millions of dollars to develop these cars. And if they're doing it that way, I want to get as close as I can to that.
Yeah. Well, I think the mentalities are different as well between kind of the old school guys and those that are doing this kind of for the first time and that are a little on the younger side. I know a lot of older school guys will say, well, if the fuel pump goes, I don't want to have to drop the tank and pull a fuel pump and blah, 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 blah. And I think a lot of people don't realize the reliability of the new pumps. It's like odds are it's not like you're going to be driving 500 miles and the pump on the in tank is going to fail. I mean, can that happen? Sure, it can. But the odds of that happening are very, very low. Right.
And I totally get that mentality. Right. Like the mechanical diaphragm style pumps that hang off the side of a small block, you'd change those, almost as often as you'd change spark plugs. Just they were reliable, but they were also easy to access, and it was because the materials technology at the time, and it wasn't going to last forever. And if I remember correctly, it was like $16 for one at an AutoZone, and when it went out, you're like, well, that's what they do. I'm not even mad. This isn't even hard to change. Right. But the modern stuff does last so much longer. You can still do a high pressure EFI pump that is external. The downside is it's going to run hotter. It's going to be louder. If your exhaust is louder than your fuel pump, who cares? And if it does go out, it's easy to change. Right.
Yeah. And I think that also goes back to your original point is, what do you want? Right. What are you trying to make the vehicle do? Is it a daily driver that you're trying to just make more reliable? Is it a performance vehicle? Is it something that you want to go drag racing on? So I think answering those questions before you embark on a kit is the most important thing to do, right? To kind of figure that out. Okay. So now let's say, okay, we've got our EFI system, customers chosen whatever they feel like is the best, engine's running fine. Okay. Now you want to go a step further, right? Now let's talk a little bit about safety, because again, we're having this kind of paradigm shift where you've got guys that are kind of in their 50s, 60s, and 70s that have been hot rodders for their entire lives. And then you've got, kids that are in their, I want to say their teens to their 40s and their, or late 40s that are going, well, I really want to embrace this new technology and I want to embrace safety, right? So I'll argument say 20 years ago, if you were to go up to a muscle car guy and say, well, you're running catalytic converters on that car, they would kind of look at you and be like, no. It was almost like a badge of pride that they pulled the cat off and kicked it to the curb or threw it in the garbage. Where nowadays, I don't see catalytic converters as a bad thing, for the simple fact that you're not really robbing that much power. You generally don't get out of the car smelling like fuel. They can help with efficiency. And so are there pros to that with the modern technology? Are new EFI systems, do they work better with a cat? Do they not? Or does it really not make a difference?
They're kind of agnostic, right? So anything that's any form of restriction in the exhaust is going to rob horsepower. To your point, cats, like every other part of the vehicle, has gotten better, right? So I think the guys that had that initial massively negative response to them was because there was less control over fuel injection. So cars, the air fuel mixtures would swing, between rich and lean. Narrow band sensors weren't great at knowing what was going on. They could only read in a very, very fixed range. So cats failed and cats clogged, and they were just a nuisance, right? Especially for guys that were racing. You couldn't just take your new factory Challenger to the drag strip and run 12s and not even have to think about it. You had to work really hard for that. So those sorts of components that just didn't make sense in a racing environment and were failure prone, just that was how they were branded into their memory, and they're just going to look at it as like, well, those are terrible, get rid of them. They're a lot better now. And to your point, I've been around dynos where taking the cats off was like less than a 10 horsepower improvement. And you're sort of like, well, the air quality is better. It's for modern daily drivers and things that are on public roads. You can kind of just forget they're there. Nobody's going to get excited about a catalytic converter, but hey, it's not slowing me down. I don't even have to think about it. And when we have to kind of remember that, there is always this magnifying glass on our culture of like, well, those are the cars that smell bad, and those are the cars that are making emissions. And whether that's true or not, and I fully believe it's not, we still have to be the brand ambassadors of like, hey, this is an emissions legal vehicle. We're doing everything we're supposed to be doing. Leave us alone. Let us still make horsepower.
Right. Exactly. So, all right, now that that's done, you want to focus a little bit on safety. Let's talk about kind of suspension and underneath the car a little. Let's talk about wheels, tires, brakes, suspension, stuff like that, sure. Right? I think that a lot of older vehicles, especially I think the GM stuff, really rides beautifully. Like if you're talking about a full size, something like an Impala or kind of like an A-body, like a Monty or a Chevelle or something like that. I personally think they're actually pretty decent driving cars, right? They're not corner carvers. You're not going to do that. But, braking, I think, is the one portion of it where it's a little terrifying when you're driving a stock older vehicle.
Yeah, completely agree. I mean, I had a C10 that I drove very often. I towed with it. I brought home heavy loads while I was fixing up my first house. It was a great truck, but when it came to actually having to slow down in modern traffic, it was a little bit sketchy. And that's just when you were designing a brake system for a tire that rode on a 14-inch rim, these were probably more than adequate. Had they been any better, you would probably be over braking the rubber that the car was issued with. But now, as we've got bigger wheels and better rubber, and all of the rest of the formula sort of comes into play. Yeah, there's not enough brake. And when your average Kia can slow down faster than your classic, it becomes a real safety concern. Can you slow down as fast as the guy in front of you?
Right. Well, you have so many braking systems out there right now that are, you're like, you have to have a 14-inch rotor and 6-piston calipers and all this stuff. Is there such a thing as too much brake, you think?
I would say it's not so much that there's too much brake behind the wheel. It's that maybe the system is too touchy, or the big thing is it proportioned correctly? Are you sending too much pressure to the rear, too much pressure to the front? That is where I think people can get themselves into the most trouble, where you've got so much brake and it's so badly balanced. You get on the pedal and the back of the car gets light and comes around on you. So I think any brake manufacturer is going to tell you, you're never going to get into a situation where you're like, dang, I have too much caliper and too much rotor and too good of a pad. It's actually setting that system up correctly to where the dynamics of the vehicle aren't negatively affected by it.
Gotcha. And I mean,
go ahead.
Yep, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think people sort of look at those big brake kits and go, oh, that's what I need. And maybe they put it off too far on their project list because it's, those huge kits are expensive. So the 6-piston calipers and 14-inch rotors, they're beautiful and they look amazing, especially on resto mods with the right wheel package. But I think people need to understand that you don't have to go that big to drastically improve the safety of your vehicle. You can have a 1-piston factory GM rotor, or GM caliper, a semi-modern size rotor, modern pad technology, and a good master cylinder, and it's still a million times better than what it rolled off the factory with.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think that also goes into the decision, or your idea of what do you want the vehicle to do, right? If you're not building a big high horsepower, performance vehicle, the odds that you need 14-inch rotors and 6-piston calipers is probably pretty small, right? If you're building a nice daily driver, kind of like what we did with the Camaro, the IROC that we built, just upgrading little things like, a newer set of rotors, stainless steel brake lines, good fluids, good pads, leaps and bounds over what you had previously. It's very funny. Like, I know on my old 68 Charger, I did a big brake kit, a quote unquote big brake kit almost 20 years ago. And that big brake kit consisted of like Corvette C4 calipers, Mustang PBR in the rear, and 13-inch rotors, under a 17-inch wheel, which now is a tiny wheel, right, based on, what OEMs are having. And everybody's like, those are huge. Now, technology has progressed in the last 20 years. Have I ever upgraded those? Well, I haven't, because I never felt the need to, because that package actually works really well for what I have. And the braking performance is actually great. So it's, again, address what you're trying to build, where you want to be from a performance level. And then, as Evan mentioned, these are not inexpensive kits. So look at budget as well, because I think you can go down a rabbit hole when it comes to upgrades, where in the back of your mind, you might want the biggest, the baddest, the latest, the greatest, but you might not need it. And so you're overbuilding something that really you don't need to overbuild, right?
Absolutely. So I've got on my 70 GTO, I have the factory, rotors, factory calipers with a modern pad. And then Summit Racing and also Right Stuff Detailing have some really reasonable disc brake swaps for the back. And it goes from a disc drummed car to a disc car, and just with the right pad in the middle. And they use pads. All of these kits use pads that you can get in AutoZone or any sort of local kind of parts store. And because it's for a common vehicle, you can get lots of different pad compositions, and it's pretty inexpensive. And for that peace of mind that this thing you've worked so hard on is not going to go into the back of somebody else's car on the brake line.
No, absolutely correct. I think when you update everything, it's great to try to get it as a cohesive package as you can. Something that is going to work well in just about any situation. And that's, be it, you're driving it to the store every day, you're driving it across the country, or you're just using it as kind of your Sunday cars and coffee card, But I think at day's end, everybody wants that same thing. They want to get in, they want to turn the key, and they just want it to work. And now I think we're at a point where the technology is such that nothing is impossible. We can upgrade these older vehicles to the point where you could pretty much build anything that you want and meet your needs. No?
Absolutely. At least for me, the most fun part of all of this is driving the car and upgrading the car, but not fixing the car. Because fixing the car means you intended to have fun with it, and then you were deprived of that fun because something broke, right? So I try to kind of get ahead of that. But the seat time is the most fun. But going down the road, making memories, getting places with friends, going to car meets, going to races, like that's what we're all here to do. So we're trying to pick all the parts that let us do that, in the way that we thought we could.
Right. Let me ask you: do you think that the idea of upgrading is changing to a point, right? So if you watch the auctions and stuff, it used to be 15, 20 years ago, everything was a numbers matching car. That's where numbers were, high dollar stuff was. But now I almost feel that people are going, well, no, I kind of want these conveniences. I want performance. I want to be able to enjoy it. And that seems to be where, in my opinion, where the hobby is going. People are looking for the resto mod or slightly resto modded vehicles.
I think you're exactly right. I think a huge part of that is, everything gets fonder with our memories, right? When we remember our first car, it was this perfect specimen of a vehicle, and we forget about all the things that sucked about it. That it didn't.
Not my first car.
Well, I can kind of think back to my first muscle car, and it was like, it didn't start when I needed it to start. It got horrible fuel economy. My girlfriend wouldn't ride in it because she smelled like oil. gasoline. So we kind of look back, and for me, that's not that long ago. I'm 33, but for some people, they're looking back 30, 40 years on their first car, and they're sort of forgetting about all these things that maybe weren't so great. And they've spent the last 20 years in a modern fuel injected vehicle that does everything they ask it to do when they ask it to do it. So they get into their original car, right? They've gotten to a point where they've got the money in their pocket. They're like, I'm going to buy that Chevelle back. And they get that Chevelle and they go drive it, and they're like, oh, this thing kind of sucks. Like, I love how it looks, but this is not how I remember this car being. So that's where those resto mods sort of come into play, where you've got the look, you've got the feel, the nostalgia of looking at that gauge pack and those, the instruments, then putting you in that mental place that you're in when you drove that car for the first time. But also, it starts when it's supposed to start. There's air conditioning. Maybe you're 60 years old at this point. You don't feel like sweating into that vinyl seat and peeling yourself off on a summer day. So I can totally understand, where the guys that finally go out and reclaim that memory in that first car go, oh, I want it to be more like this 2021 Silverado that's parked in my driveway.
Right.
I'm too old to drive this C10 the way I used to drive it. So there's definitely a place for that. And honestly, I love unboxing, parts. Like, it's so much fun. Like, none of us have to spend any money on this stuff, right? There's no one behind you going, this is definitely a good idea. It's just fun. Right. And I mean, when you can make something mechanically work just a little bit better, like, boy, that's a good feeling. Right. God, what a great what a great comment. I mean, and that truly is. And it's funny because I got some years on you, but I remember, the daily drivers kind of being shit boxes and being to the point where it was like, oh, I really want the AC and I'd love power windows and I'd love all this stuff. Right. But it was funny. Not too long ago, actually, when we were down at kind of MPMC, I had gone just because it was down there. I looked at a 70 Challenger. That was a couple of miles away from where we were, and it was a 318 bone stock 70 Challenger. And I went and I saw the car, and I got in the car and I drove the car. And within like 4 blocks, I was like, "This is terrible," And I started to kind of go down the rabbit hole of where I've been with driving. I don't know how many hundreds of cars in my career and kind of filming cars and doing all that other stuff, and realizing that I don't want this. And then I started going down the rabbit hole of, God, well, how much time, energy, money is it going to take to bring the car back to a level that I can potentially drive it, not that I'm going to, but drive it every day or just enjoy it and have all those comforts, conveniences. And when I look at auction prices now and you see these resto mods going for anywhere, let's just say, argument's sake, 60 grand up, right, for a decent one, whatever. And I go, oh my God, I think that's just so worth it. I think it's worth it to have the, perfectly starting car every time and the enjoyment factor of it. Not to say that unboxing parts isn't fun, it is, but I'm also at the point where I'm just like, I just want stuff done that I can enjoy. Yeah, and not everybody has the garage situation to be able to do it themselves, or the know-how, or the time, or even the physical capability. I mean, think about how beat up you get after spending a weekend under a car, hoisting big heavy parts around. That just isn't on the table for everybody. So sometimes there is, a huge value in buying this resto mod that has all of this stuff done, that has the late model engine swap. I mean, when I get out of my GTO, I feel so much cooler than when I get out of my Nissan Xterra. And you're never going to be able to replicate that feeling with anything that isn't that car that holds that special place in your heart. So I love resto mods. I also have a lot of respect for the guy that drives the flathead powered thing, and enjoys it and is perfectly fine with a windshield that's this big, no AC, non-functional fuel sender. Like, he's just on a dream and a prayer and loves it. So, I mean, it takes all kinds. No, it definitely does. Well, dude, thank you so much for coming on the show. And what I'll say this to everybody that's listening: if you have questions for myself, if you have questions for Evan, post them in the comments on YouTube, post them in the comments on the on the webpage, on the Hemmings site, and ask us questions. We Evan and I are both with Hemmings. This is what we do. We are here to answer your questions and give you advice if we can, and kind of guide you in the right direction. So I think one of the biggest problems is that,
people listen to too many of their friends or the internet, and their ideas of what they actually want get skewed, as opposed to thinking of a good plan, of a good build, and sticking to that until it's completed, right? I'm here to tell you that we are here to kind of bring you back to reality if we can, and keep you on the straight and narrow. So yeah, leave comments, tell us what you think. And otherwise, that's it, man. Evan, you got anything else? Any other words of wisdom for people?
Keep driving old cars, man. It gives us purpose.
It does give us purpose. And obviously, if you want an old car, go to the Hemmings website. We've got 25,000 cars online in our classifieds. We got a kick-ass auction. I guarantee you will find something you like. But otherwise, people, that's it. And we shall see you next time on the Hot Rod BBQ Podcast. Thanks for listening, folks. And again, please subscribe to the Hot Rod BBQ Podcast. If you're on Spotify, check us out there. Subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you are going to go to YouTube, make sure you go to the Hot Rod BBQ Podcast and hit that subscribe button. And we'll come to you every week.